What happens when a gang of racist thugs mistakes a quiet, heavyset black farmer for an easy target? When they see only his size, his color, and his gentle demeanor, but remain blind to the lethal training that lies beneath. And what occurs when their campaign of terror awakens not just a farmer protecting his land, but a warrior whose skills were forged in the world's most elite military unit? This is the extraordinary true story of Otis Freeman, a man whose peaceful exterior concealed one of the most dangerous skill sets known to mankind. To his neighbors in rural Georgia, he was simply Big O, a soft-spoken farmer who tended his crops with the same methodical precision he once brought to classified operations in foreign lands. But to the racist gang that targeted him, he was about to become their worst nightmare. Picture this: a man who had crawled through enemy territory under cover of darkness, who had neutralized threats with his bare hands, who had served his country with distinction in the Navy SEALs, now choosing to serve the earth instead of warfare. His transition from soldier to farmer represented hope, proof that warriors could become healers, that those trained to take life could dedicate themselves to nurturing it instead. But this story is about more than one man's journey from military service to agricultural peace. It's about the harsh reality facing black farmers across America, who have lost over 90% of their land since 1920 due to systematic discrimination, violence, and economic exploitation. It's about the double burden carried by black veterans who served their country abroad only to face racism and discrimination at home. And it's about the moment when quiet dignity meets explosive violence, when a man's past and present collide in ways that no one, least of all his attackers, could have anticipated. This is a story of land, legacy, and the lengths one man will go to protect both. It's about the assumptions we make based on appearance, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating those who have chosen peace over war, but retain the skills to wage it when necessary. Otis Freeman's journey to becoming a farmer began in the humid backwoods of rural Georgia, where his grandfather had worked the same 200 acres of red clay soil for over 60 years. Born in 1975, Otis grew up understanding that the land beneath his feet carried the weight of history, not just his family's history, but the broader story of Black Americans' complex relationship with agriculture and land ownership. His grandfather, Moses Freeman, had been part of the nearly 1 million black farmers who worked American soil in the 1920s, when African Americans represented 14% of all farmers in the United States. Moses had purchased the land through a combination of backbreaking labor, careful saving, and the kind of determination that characterized a generation of black farmers who refused to let discrimination crush their dreams of ownership and independence. But Moses had also lived through the systematic forces that would eventually reduce the number of black farmers by over 90%. He had experienced the USDA's discriminatory lending practices, the denial of subsidies and grants, the deliberate exclusion from agricultural programs that helped white farmers thrive. He had watched as neighbors lost their farms to foreclosure, unable to access the same government assistance that sustained their white counterparts. The soil don't see color, Moses would tell young Otis, but the men who control the money and the programs sure do. Growing up, Otis had witnessed the slow disappearance of black farmers from the rural landscape. Family friends who had worked the land for generations were forced to sell to developers or large agricultural corporations. The vibrant community of black farmers that had once defined the area gradually gave way to isolated families struggling to maintain their heritage in an increasingly hostile environment. The racism wasn't always overt. It was often embedded in the bureaucratic structures that governed agricultural life. Black farmers found their loan applications delayed or denied, their subsidy payments withheld, their participation in conservation programs discouraged. The discrimination was so systematic that it would eventually lead to the largest civil rights settlement in American history when the Pigford The Glickman case resulted in over $2 billion in payments to black farmers who had been discriminated against by the U.S. As a young man, Otis had felt the weight of this history and the responsibility of preserving his family's legacy. But he had also felt called to serve his country, driven by a belief that military service could provide both personal growth and economic opportunity. At 18, he enlisted in the Navy, beginning a journey that would take him far from the Georgia farmland, but never truly away from its influence. His path to becoming a Navy SEAL had been marked by the same determination that had characterized his grandfather's approach to farming. The training was brutal physically, mentally, and emotionally devastating. Of the 180 candidates who began BDS training with his class, only 23 graduated. Otis was one of them, earning the trident that marked him as one of the military's most elite warriors. For 12 years, Otis served his country with distinction. He participated in classified operations across multiple theaters, developing skills in reconnaissance, direct action, and counterterrorism that few humans ever possess. His teammates knew him as a man of few words, but decisive action, someone who could be counted on to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. His size, which had once made him a target for bullies, became an asset in his military career, providing the physical strength necessary for the demanding requirements of special operations. But throughout his military service, Otis carried with him the memory of his grandfather's land and the knowledge that black farmers were continuing to lose their ancestral property. During his deployments, he would receive letters from his mother describing the ongoing struggles of their rural community farms being sold to developers, families forced to leave land they had worked for generations, the slow erosion of a way of life that had sustained black Americans for over a century. The decision to leave military service and return to farming was not made lightly. Otis understood that he was walking away from a career that had provided him with purpose, brotherhood, and financial security. But he also understood that his grandfather's land represented something more important, a connection to history, a source of independence, and a foundation for future generations of his family. When Otis returned to Georgia in 2015, he brought with him not just his grandfather's farming knowledge, but also skills that no farmer in the region possessed. He had learned to move silently, to observe without being observed, to plan meticulously, and to execute with precision. These skills, developed in the service of national security, would soon be applied to protecting something far more personal: the land that connected him to his ancestors and his identity as a black man in America. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday evening in July 2018, when Otis Freeman attended what was supposed to be a routine town hall meeting about proposed developments in the rural district outside Millbrook, Georgia. The meeting, held in the basement of the local library, had drawn an unusually large crowd, a mix of longtime residents, real estate developers, and local officials who rarely ventured into the predominantly black farming community. Otis had arrived early, settling into a back row seat with the quiet observational skills that had served him during reconnaissance missions. He watched as the crowd filtered in, noting the clear divisions between the established residents and the newcomers who seemed to view the area through entirely different lenses. The developers spoke about underutilized land and economic opportunity, while the farmers talked about heritage and sustainability. The presentation centered on a proposed residential development that would transform over 3,000 acres of farmland into a gated community called Heritage Hills. The irony of the name was not lost on Otis. The development would eliminate much of the actual heritage represented by the black-owned farms that had operated in the area for generations. When the floor opened for questions, Otis stood to speak. His voice, deep and measured, carried the quiet authority that had made him an effective military leader. "I'm curious about the environmental impact assessments," he said, his tone respectful but probing. This area has been in continuous agricultural use for over a century. What studies have been done on soil disruption, water table changes, and the impact on existing agricultural operations? The questions were legitimate, the kind that any responsible community member might ask. But as Otis continued to speak, he noticed something troubling in the room's dynamic. Several men in leather jackets and Confederate flag patches had positioned themselves near the exits, and their attention was focused not on the developer's answers, but on him. After the meeting, as residents filtered out into the humid night air, Otis found himself approached by three men who had been watching him throughout the presentation. The leader, a heavy-set man with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos, stepped directly into Otis's path. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who don't belong here," a man said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that Otis had learned to recognize during his military service. "I'm Wade Graham, and this is my territory. You people need to understand that some things are changing around here, whether you like it or not." Otis's response was measured and polite. "I'm Otis Freeman. My family has been farming this land for 3 generations. I'm just concerned about how development might affect our operations." Wade's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Freeman, huh? That's the old place up on County Road 14. Big spread, lot of valuable land. Shame to see it going to waste with someone who don't know how to use it properly." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Wade making increasingly direct references to Otis's race and his right to be in the area. His companions, later identified as Marcus Webb and Tyler Hutchins, remained silent but maintained positions that Otis recognized as tactically threatening. These men had clearly worked together before, and their body language suggested they were comfortable with intimidation and violence. "You seem like a smart man," Wade said as the conversation concluded. "Smart enough to know when it's time to make a good business decision. We'll be in touch about your land. I think you'll find our offer very generous." Otis returned to his farm that night with a clear understanding that he had been marked as a target. His military training had taught him to recognize threat patterns, and everything about the encounter suggested that this was not a random interaction, but part of a broader campaign. The escalation began 3 days later. Otis awakened to find that someone had cut his fence lines during the night, allowing his cattle to wander onto the county road. While he was rounding up the animals, he noticed fresh tire tracks in his fields, and evidence that someone had been surveying his property. The message was clear: "We can access your land whenever we want." The harassment continued over the following weeks. A shed mysteriously caught fire, destroying several $1,000s worth of equipment. His mailbox was vandalized with racial slurs. Phone calls in the middle of the night featured heavy breathing and whispered threats. Someone shot out the lights on his barn, and his driveway was blocked with fallen trees that had been obviously cut and positioned to create obstacles. Throughout this period, Otis maintained careful documentation of each incident. His wife, Shirley, an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases, had taught him the importance of building a comprehensive record. Every threat was photographed, every incident was logged with precise times and descriptions, and every interaction was preserved as potential evidence. But the gang's confidence grew with each successful act of harassment. They began to appear during daylight hours, driving slowly past his property in their trucks, honking horns and shouting threats. They spray-painted racial slurs on his fence posts and left crude symbols that were clearly designed to intimidate. Breaking point came on a sweltering night in August. Otis was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching his property, their headlights cutting through the darkness like search beams. From his bedroom window, he watched as 5 figures emerged from 2 trucks, carrying what appeared to be weapons and incendiary devices. Wade Grimes' voice carried clearly across the night air. Time to teach this boy a lesson about respecting his betters. Maybe after tonight, he'll be more interested in our generous offer. What followed was a coordinated attack on Otis's property. The gang members began with systematic vandalism, smashing fence posts, spray painting racial slurs, and destroying equipment. But the violence escalated quickly. 3 Molotov cocktails crashed through the windows of his barn, setting the structure ablaze. Gunshots rang out as the attackers fired at his livestock, killing several cattle and sending others fleeing in panic. But the attackers whooped and celebrated their destruction, clearly believing they had the upper hand against a lone farmer who had no recourse against their violence. They had no idea that they were not facing a helpless victim, but rather a man whose training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. As the barn burned and the gunshots echoed across the property, Otis Freeman made a decision that would transform him from victim to hunter. The peaceful farmer who had been enduring harassment for months was about to remind these men that some warriors never truly retire. They simply choose when to reveal their true nature. The gang had awakened something in Otis that he had hoped to leave behind forever. But as he watched his grandfather's legacy burning in the night, he understood that some fights cannot be avoided, and some enemies can only be stopped through the precise application of the skills he had learned in service to his country. Next phase of the confrontation would reveal just how costly it could be to mistake a Navy SEAL for an easy target. The morning after the attack, Otis Freeman stood in the smoldering ruins of his barn, surveying the damage with the same methodical precision he had once brought to post-mission assessments. The destruction was extensive. 3 buildings burned, over a dozen cattle killed, equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars destroyed. But it was the desecration of his grandfather's legacy that cut deepest, transforming his professional approach to the situation into something far more personal. Shirley arrived as the fire department was completing their investigation, her legal mind already working through the implications of what had occurred. "This is a federal hate crime," she said, photographing the racial slurs that had been spray-painted across the surviving structures. "We have documentation of the systematic harassment, witnesses to the threats, and now physical evidence of arson and destruction of property." But both Otis and Shirley understood that the legal system moved slowly, and there was no guarantee that local law enforcement would pursue the case with the urgency it deserved. The sheriff's department had been notably unresponsive to previous reports of harassment, and some of the deputies had family connections to the men who had been terrorizing the farm. "I need to protect what's left," Otis told his wife. "And I need to make sure they understand that this doesn't end with them getting what they want." The transformation that followed was subtle but complete. Otis began by implementing security measures that drew on his military training but were appropriate for a civilian context. He installed motion-activated cameras throughout the property, positioned to capture clear images of any intruders. He established tripwires and early warning systems that would alert him to unauthorized presence on his land. He prepared non-lethal countermeasures, smoke canisters, flashbang devices, and sonic disruptors that could disorient attackers without causing permanent harm. But the most significant change was in Otis himself. The gentle farmer who had been absorbing harassment for months began to move with the fluid precision of a man who had spent years preparing for combat. He rose before dawn for physical training, rebuilding the fitness levels that had been required for special operations. He practiced the close-quarters combat techniques that had been drilled into him during his military service. He cleaned and maintained weapons that had been stored away. Since his return to civilian life, the gang's response to the barn burning was to escalate their intimidation campaign. They began driving past the property multiple times per day, sometimes stopping to shout threats or throw bottles. They harassed Shirley when she traveled to town for groceries or legal work. They spread rumors throughout the community that Otis was dangerous and unstable, attempting to isolate the family from potential sources of support. Wade Grimes' crew also began targeting other black farmers in the area, clearly attempting to create a climate of fear that would pressure multiple families to sell their land. They vandalized the property of Marcus Thompson, an elderly farmer whose family had worked the same land for 4 generations. They blocked the driveway of Sarah Williams, a young agricultural extension agent who had been helping local farmers access federal programs. They spray-painted threats on the mailbox of Pastor James Mitchell, whose church had been supporting the farming community. The broader campaign revealed the scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about Otis's land, it was about systematically eliminating black farmers from the area to clear the way for development, projects that would benefit a small group of investors and real estate developers. The gang was functioning as an unofficial enforcement arm for economic interests that were too sophisticated to engage in direct violence, but were willing to benefit from it. As the harassment intensified, Otis made a decision that would define the remainder of the conflict. Rather than simply defending his property, he would go on the offensive, using his SEAL training to gather intelligence about his attackers and build a case that would expose the entire network of corruption and violence. Working with Shirley, he began conducting surveillance operations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. He used his skills in reconnaissance to document meetings between gang members and local officials, photographing license plates and recording conversations that revealed the financial motivations behind the harassment campaign. He tracked the movements of key players, identifying their daily routines and vulnerabilities. The intelligence gathering revealed that Wade Grimes was not just a random racist, but a key player in a larger network of corruption that included local politicians, law enforcement officials, and business leaders. The gang's terrorism campaign was being protected by a sheriff's department that had been compromised by bribes and political pressure. The development project that had triggered the initial confrontation was being fast-tracked through a permitting process that had been manipulated to benefit specific investors. Most importantly, Otis discovered that the gang was planning a final decisive assault on his property. Intercepted communications revealed that they intended to burn down his house with him inside, making it appear to be an accident or the result of a domestic dispute. The plan was to eliminate him as a witness and a source of resistance, clearing the way for the forced sale of his land to the development consortium. The knowledge that his family was facing an imminent threat of lethal violence transformed Otis's approach to the situation. He was no longer dealing with harassment or intimidation. He was facing a conspiracy to commit murder. The rules of engagement had changed, and his response would need to reflect that reality. The night before the planned attack, Otis made final preparations that drew on every aspect of his military training. He positioned himself in a concealed observation post that provided clear sight lines across his property. He activated defensive systems that would channel attackers into predetermined zones where they could be observed and neutralized. He prepared weapons and equipment that would allow him to respond to lethal threats with appropriate force. But perhaps most importantly, he prepared himself psychologically for the transition from farmer back to warrior. For 3 years, he had been trying to build a life based on nurturing and creation, rather than destruction and violence. Now, faced with threats to his family and his legacy, he was about to remind himself, and his attackers exactly, what he was capable of when peaceful solutions were no longer possible. The man who had once served his country in classified operations around the world was about to defend his own land with the same skills and determination that had made him one of the military's most elite warriors. The final confrontation came on a moonless night in late September, when Wade Grimes' gang arrived at the Freeman farm with the intention of ending their campaign of terror with lethal violence. 5 vehicles approached the property at 2:47 a.m., their occupants armed with automatic weapons, improvised explosive devices, and the confidence that comes from months of unchallenged intimidation. What they encountered instead was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of why Navy SEALs are considered among the world's most dangerous warriors. Otis had been tracking their approach for over an hour, using night vision equipment and motion sensors to monitor their movements from his concealed position in an elevated hunting blind. His observation post provided clear sight lines across the property while remaining invisible to anyone approaching from ground level. He had prepared for this confrontation with the same methodical precision that had characterized his military operations, but with an important difference. His objective was not elimination, but capture and evidence preservation. The gang's first mistake was their assumption that they were facing a single, isolated target. They spread out across the property in a loose formation that would have been appropriate for intimidating a civilian, but left them vulnerable to a trained operator who understood their tactics and capabilities. Their second mistake was their reliance on surprise and overwhelming force rather than reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. As the attackers moved through the darkness toward the farmhouse, they triggered a series of non-lethal countermeasures that Otis had positioned throughout the property. Motion-activated strobe lights began flashing in sequence, creating disorientation and confusion among the gang members. Smoke canisters deployed automatically, filling key areas with dense fog that concealed Otis's movements while blinding his attackers. Sonic disruptors emitted high-frequency sounds that further disrupted their coordination and communication. The psychological impact of these countermeasures was immediate and devastating. The gang members, who had expected to find a helpless victim, instead found themselves trapped in what felt like a sophisticated military operation. Their shouted communications revealed panic and confusion as they realized they were not in control of the situation. Otis moved through the chaos with the fluid precision of a predator, using his training to neutralize threats while preserving evidence and avoiding lethal force. His first target was Marcus Webb, who had been carrying the improvised explosive device intended for the farmhouse. Otis approached from behind, using a sleeper hold to render Webb unconscious before he could detonate the device. The technique was precisely applied, enough pressure to cause immediate unconsciousness without permanent damage. Tyler Hutchins, who had been advancing on the farmhouse with an assault rifle, found himself caught in a carefully positioned snare trap that left him suspended and helpless. Otis quickly disarmed him and secured him with zip ties, all while remaining invisible to the other attackers who were still struggling with the countermeasures. The remaining gang members, realizing that their assault was failing catastrophically, attempted to retreat to their vehicles. But Otis had anticipated this response, and he had prepared additional surprises for anyone who tried to flee. Spike strips disabled 2 of their vehicles, while caltrops scattered across the escape routes ensured that no one would be leaving the property before law enforcement arrived. Wade Graham, the gang's leader, found himself isolated and surrounded by the evidence of his own failed operation. His weapons had been systematically removed, his escape routes blocked, and his co-conspirators either unconscious or secured. When Otis finally revealed himself, emerging from the shadows with his rifle trained on Graham, the gang leader faced the reality of his situation. "You made a lot of assumptions about me," Otis said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him an effective military leader. "You assumed I was weak because I chose farming over fighting. You assumed I was helpless because I'm different from you. You assumed I would let you terrorize my family without consequences." Graham's response was a mixture of rage and fear. "You're a dead man, Freeman. You think this is over? You think you can get away with this?" "I think," Otis replied, "that you're about to learn the difference between harassment and justice." The arrival of federal law enforcement was swift and decisive. Shirley had been coordinating with FBI agents who had been building a case against the gang's broader network of corruption. The evidence that Otis had gathered during his surveillance operations, combined with the physical evidence from the failed assault, provided more than enough justification for federal hate crime charges. As Wade Graham and his associates were arrested and taken into custody, Otis Freeman stood in the ruins of his barn, surrounded by the evidence of his own victory. The gentle farmer who had been targeted for destruction had instead become the instrument of justice for his entire community. The man who had once served his country in foreign lands had proven that some battles must be fought at home, and that the skills learned in service to the nation could be applied to protecting the values and people that make that service meaningful. The Navy SEAL who had become a farmer had shown that warriors never truly retire, they simply choose. When their skills are needed most, the federal investigation that followed the failed assault on the Freeman farm revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single gang's harassment campaign. The evidence that Otis had methodically gathered, combined with the intelligence uncovered during the arrests, exposed a network of corruption that reached into local government, law enforcement, and business communities throughout the region. Wade Graham and his associates were charged with federal hate crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and domestic terrorism. The evidence against them was overwhelming, not just the physical evidence from the assault on the farm, but also the extensive documentation of their months-long campaign of harassment and intimidation. The case became a model for how systematic harassment could be prosecuted under federal hate crime statutes, but the investigation revealed that the gang had been operating with protection from corrupt officials who had been compromised by bribes and political pressure. Sheriff's deputies who had ignored reports of harassment were found to have financial connections to the development consortium that was seeking to acquire black-owned farmland. Local politicians who had fast-tracked development permits were discovered to have received substantial campaign contributions from the same sources. The exposure of this corruption led to a broader reckoning within the community. Sheriff Marcus Reynolds, who had been dismissive of complaints from black farmers, was forced to resign when federal investigators found evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy. 2 county commissioners were indicted on charges of accepting bribes and manipulating the permitting process. Several local businesses that had been supporting the harassment campaign faced boycotts and legal challenges. The transformation of Otis Freeman from victim to victor had catalyzed a broader movement for justice that extended throughout the region. Other black farmers who had been facing harassment and intimidation found their voices and began speaking out about their experiences. The media attention generated by the case attracted support from civil rights organizations, veterans groups, and agricultural advocacy organizations. The community response to the revelation of Otis's military background was complex and revealing. Some residents who had previously been dismissive or hostile became respectful and supportive, recognizing that they had been living alongside a genuine American hero. Others struggled to reconcile their preconceptions about black farmers with the reality of Otis's service and capabilities. The rebuilding of the Freeman farm became a community effort that transcended racial and economic boundaries. Veterans organizations contributed labor and materials to reconstruct the burned buildings. Agricultural extension services provided technical assistance and equipment. Churches and civic organizations organized fundraising events and volunteer work days. But perhaps most importantly, the case led to the establishment of the Rural Legacy Protection Initiative, a program designed to protect minority farmers from harassment and discrimination. The initiative provided legal assistance, security consultation, and advocacy services to farmers who faced threats to their property and livelihood. It also created a network of support that connected isolated farmers with resources and assistance that had previously been unavailable. The impact on Otis himself was profound and lasting. The transition from peaceful farmer to active protector had reconnected him with aspects of his military training that he had hoped to leave behind. But it had also demonstrated that his skills and experience could be applied to protecting values and people that were important to him. The farm that had been under siege became a symbol of resilience and resistance. Visitors from across the country came to see the place where a Navy SEAL had stood his ground against domestic terrorism. Agricultural students studied the sustainable farming practices that Otis had developed. Civil rights scholars examined the case as an example of how systematic harassment could be successfully challenged. The legal proceedings continued for months, with federal prosecutors building comprehensive cases against each member of the conspiracy. The trials attracted national attention, with media coverage that highlighted both the persistence of rural racism and the effectiveness of federal hate crime statutes in addressing systematic harassment. The sentences were substantial and appropriate. Wade Graham received 25 years in federal prison for his role in leading the conspiracy. His associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 18 years. The corrupt officials who had protected them faced their own legal consequences, with several receiving prison sentences and others being forced to resign from public service. 5 years after the assault on his farm, Otis Freeman continued to work the land that his grandfather had purchased and that he had defended with skills learned in service to his country. The farm had become more than a place of agricultural production. It had become a symbol of what was possible when courage, training, and determination were applied to the protection of justice and heritage. The story of the fat black farmer, who had surprised his attackers with his military background, became a legend that was told and retold throughout the region, serving as both a warning to those who would prey on the vulnerable and an inspiration to those who faced their own struggles against discrimination and intimidation. The story of Otis Freeman offers profound lessons about the dangerous consequences of prejudice, the hidden strengths that lie within our communities, and the power of preparation and determination in the face of systematic oppression. His experience demonstrates that racism often manifests through assumptions about who is powerful and who is vulnerable, who deserves respect and who can be intimidated with impunity. The gang that targeted Otis saw only what they expected to see: a heavyset black farmer who appeared to be an easy target for harassment and intimidation. They failed to recognize the disciplined warrior who had chosen peace over war, but retained the skills to defend himself and his family when peace was no longer possible. Their prejudice blinded them to the reality of who they were actually confronting, and that blindness led to their downfall. But perhaps more importantly, Otis's story reveals the broader context of systematic discrimination that has affected black farmers for over a century. The loss of over 90% of black-owned farmland since 1920 represents one of the most significant wealth transfers in American history, achieved through a combination of discriminatory government policies, economic exploitation, and the kind of violence and intimidation that Otis faced. The successful defense of his farm was not just a personal victory, but a symbol of resistance against the forces that have driven black families from their ancestral lands. It demonstrated that with proper preparation, community support, and access to legal resources, individuals can successfully challenge even systematic campaigns of harassment and intimidation. For viewers, this story serves as both warning and inspiration. It reminds us that we should never make assumptions about the capabilities or backgrounds of those around us, and that the quiet, peaceful individuals in our communities may have depths of experience and strength that we cannot imagine. It shows that military service creates obligations that extend beyond active duty, and that the skills learned in service to a country can be applied to protecting the values and people that make that service meaningful. Most importantly, Otis Freeman's story proves that when we stand up to bullies and terrorists, whether they operate internationally or in our own communities, we can prevail. The tools of oppression are powerful, but they are not invincible when faced with proper preparation, community support, and the courage to fight for what is right.